Mexico's Small Business Development Center Network's Gateway to Exporting program. My name is Dante DiGregorio, and I am a consultant on the Gateway to Exporting program, as well as a professor at UNM's Anderson School of Management. This is the third part of a three-part series on doing business in Mexico, and this presentation will focus on the many Mexicos, looking at variation within Mexico by socioeconomic segment, by region, and by industry. Now, I think it's important to appreciate the diversity that exists within Mexico. Looking from the United States, we tend to be very accustomed to the idea of the United States being a very diverse society in economic terms, in cultural terms, and in terms of industry characteristics. And sometimes there's a tendency to oversimplify and overgeneralize when looking at other countries such as Mexico. So I think it's important to understand a bit of this variation across these different dimensions. Just to start off with a snapshot of Mexico's demographics from the 2010 census, which became available in the second half of 2011. Mexico's population as of 2010 consisted of 112 million people. And just as a comparison so that you can see the growth over time, in 1950 there were 25 million people in Mexico. The median age continues to be very young relative to most developed countries. About 20 years ago it was under 20 years of age. Today it's risen, but it's still at 27.6 years of age, meaning half of the population is younger than that. The U.S., for comparison's sake, has a median age of 36.6. In Japan, and Germany is very similar, has a median age about 45. So Mexico has a very young population, although it's one that is gradually aging. The literacy rate is now fairly high, at 93%. It was 87% in 1990. If you were to look at school attainment levels, you'd see an even more dramatic change over these past 20 years. Previously, only about half of the population had access to primary education, and now that's risen far above 90%, and it's between 95 and 100%. Lower in certain key states, though. Educational expenditures are roughly equivalent to the U.S. in terms of percentage of GDP, though obviously they're working from a much lower GDP base than the U.S. Life expectancy is not terribly different from the United States, just 3 years behind at 76 years. Mexico exhibits a similar level of urbanization. Like the United States, it has a rich tradition based in rural settings, but the reality is that the current population is primarily urban, and this contrasts with many other big emerging markets like, say, India, for instance. Internet users, just as a sign of access to advanced technology, now 31% of Mexico's population self-identifies as being regularly using the internet. In the U.S., it's 79% as a point of comparison. And so Mexico is still behind in these more advanced levels, advanced indicators of well-being. Access to piped water, what we used to call potable water basically, is about 92%. If you look at what households are able to afford and possess, 82% possess refrigerators, basically 30% possess a computer, and 44% possess a car or light truck. GDP per capita, as mentioned in a previous presentation, is, depending on whether you translate it just in nominal terms or if you account for differences in purchasing power, parity is between 8,000 and 14,000. So Mexico is very much a middle-income country. Within these averages, you need to appreciate some of the variation Historically, Mexico has had a very unequal distribution of income and wealth. This is actually improving in the sense of becoming more equitable, but it continues to have a small group of ultra-rich, a middle class that is growing and is quite substantial now at about 60% of the population, and a declining segment that's in poverty, but it's still a segment that's far too large. About 40% of Mexico's population is living below the poverty line, with about half of those, about 20%, in real dire poverty. The big trend over the past decade has been the expansion of the middle class and improvement of distribution of income. And this is a trend that we see throughout Latin America, a region that historically has been known for very unequal distribution of income, but is becoming a little bit more equitable, while other countries in other parts of the world, including developed countries like the United States, as well as developing countries such as China, are becoming less equal. So Mexico is no longer very unique in this respect. It's no longer very unusual in its inequality, because it's becoming slightly more equal while other countries are becoming less equal. It's important to point out, as I mentioned at the very beginning, that so far I've been talking about national averages. I'll get into regional variation later, but these national averages really mask this high degree of regional variation. So if we were to look at access to potable water, in many states it is virtually 100%. And then if you go to the south, overwhelmingly the southern states of Chiapas, Oaxaca, Guerrero, those states are almost like a different country. The majority of the population lives in poverty and has limited access or no access to very basic basic services. So, at risk of overgeneralizing, you can basically take Mexico's population and carve it up into 5 different socioeconomic segments, equal in size. So these 5 tiers each account for approximately 20% of Mexico's population. Starting from the base, the E segment, and these sort of map onto these labels that marketers use for different market segments. Basically, D and E consist of people living below the poverty line, and so this would be about 40% of Mexico's population of 112 million. At the D level, they live below the poverty line, and their basic needs are not always met. So there may be some nourishment issues, some nutritional issues, as well as limits to access to basic health. But at the level of extreme poverty, this consists of people whose basic needs often are not met and really are living in a dire state. That segment is declining in size, but remains still considerable for the country. The big story over the past decade has been the expansion of the middle class, in the sense that a large segment that used to be in the D category, and this generally consists of people living in rural areas, and if they're in urban areas, employed in the informal sector, these sort of ambulatory vendors on the street and so forth. A lot of those people have been brought into the formal economy and have improved their livelihoods, so that now they would be considered lower middle class, and that's basically defined as people who can allocate at least 30% of their income to discretionary expenditures. Discretionary expenditures, as you see some of these listed in the above category of C, would consist of things like additional investments in education beyond what is publicly provided. Mexico has a public education system, but an increasing, a growing private sector education system, both at the primary, secondary, as well as at the higher education level. Access to travel, accessories, health, electronics, and health beyond, again, the public sector, which provides a basic public healthcare system. The C segment which, like the others, would comprise about 20% of the population, is middle class in a way that it begins to look a bit more like what we would consider middle class in the United States. These are people who may be putting their children in private school or investing in higher education, engaging in some travel. If you travel in Mexico's growing discount airlines, you'll find a lot of people who, sort of evident, are not routine travelers because maybe they don't understand some of the, aren't familiar with some of the procedures that routine travelers would take as commonplace. So this is an indication that these people have access to air travel for the first time. The private healthcare sector is growing. Electronics sales are booming. Flat screen TVs, just like in the US, and so forth. And then the top tier, which would comprise the A, B, and C plus sectors, really would live a lifestyle similar to upper and middle class people in the United States. At the A level, we're talking about the ultra rich. This is perhaps 1% to 2% of Mexican society. You'll see pockets of Mexico where there's this extreme wealth, which is often accompanied by a desire to flaunt that wealth, as it is in other countries. And so these are the different economic segments of Mexico. Here we have a map of the country, which you might want to go back to as we begin to look at the regional variation. I'm not going to discuss all the different regions. I'll just focus on those that are most economically significant. Moving from Mexico City, which consists of the federal district, the red spot in the center, as well as the surrounding state of Mexico. The city of Monterrey, which is due north in the state of Nuevo León, near the U.S. border, and the city of Guadalajara, which is in Jalisco, due west of Mexico City. Monterrey and Guadalajara being the second and third largest cities, relatively equal in size. And then we'll discuss the border. I won't discuss the southern region, which is a very distinct region. I mentioned previously those three most southern states of Guerrero, Oaxaca, Chiapas are the states that are highest in terms of indigenous population. They're overwhelmingly indigenous, and they tend to be the three bottom states in terms of most socioeconomic indicators, whether it's access to basic services like electricity and potable water, or any other indicator like that. First off, the place to start is Mexico City. This is the center of Mexico geographically, culturally, politically. The capital, broadly defined, but not just the federal district, but the metropolitan area, consists of about 25 million inhabitants. And depending on where you draw the lines, it can claim to be the largest or one of the largest cities in the world. There are about 15 different cities that, depending where you draw the boundaries, can make that claim. The federal district, much like the District of Columbia, is a separate entity. It's the seat of power for government, but unlike the United States, where we have New York as the financial hub, in Mexico's case, Mexico City is also the financial hub and the corporate hub. So most corporate headquarters, about 70 something or 80% of the Expansión 500, the largest 500 companies in Mexico, have their headquarters in Mexico City. The government is based there. The one thing that's not based there anymore is manufacturing, which after the 1985 earthquake, there was a concerted effort to push manufacturing out of the city to help develop other regions and to sort of temper the growth of Mexico City. People from Mexico City are known as Chilangos, which is a widely used, although in some cases somewhat derogatory term, but they're known for a very fast-paced, chaotic lifestyle. And as you can imagine, with 25 million people crammed into a relatively small space, it's cosmopolitan. There's a status-conscious culture. It's somewhat similar to New York, although with a very distinctly Mexican flavor to it. Then the second and third largest cities, which are really comparable in size, are Monterrey and Guadalajara, which each have about 4 million people in them. Monterrey is in the border state of Nuevo León, south of San Antonio. It's not immediately on the border. It's known as the Sultan of the North. Traditionally, its economy was heavily focused on heavier industry, things like steel, autos, other metal bending type of businesses. Over the past decade or two, there's been a migration towards more new economy activities, higher value-added activities. It's an expensive place to do business relative to other parts of Mexico, and so they really have upgraded to more higher value-added manufacturing and even R&D activities. Cemex, the world's third largest cement company, is based there, as are a series of companies that all sprung out of Grupo Monterrey, which became which was a beer company which was vertically integrated and split off its glass division, split off its steel division, which made the caps for the bottles, and it has a separate beverage division, which themselves are all major multinationals at this point. The people from Monterrey, the Regiomontanos, are sort of like the Texans of Mexico. And Monterrey, I lived there, and I lived in San Antonio, and I always tell people they're pretty similar cities. They speak a little bit more Spanish in Monterrey, but it's a place with strip malls and shopping malls and air-conditioned places, and whereas Mexico City has the Zócalo, a big historic plaza. In every city in Mexico has its own plaza. In Monterrey, they have the Macro Plaza. So just like somewhat similar to Texans, their plaza isn't necessarily the prettiest plaza, but it's the biggest. It's the Macro Plaza. So then we move to a similar size city, but a very different city of Guadalajara, and its surrounding state of Jalisco. In many respects, this is the Mexican city in the sense of representing many of Mexico's best-known traditions. From that surrounding state of Jalisco come the equipales, the furniture that's very familiar, the tequila that people know, the mariachis, the Mexican cowboys, ceramics, textiles, but also more recently, the high-tech sector of Mexico, and electronics in particular, have been based in the Guadalajara area, starting with IBM, which has been there for many decades, and mostly dominated these days by a large number of contract manufacturers that are making products for the brands that we're all familiar with. The people from this area, the Tapatíos, reflect this unique mixture that exists between traditional Mexico with a global orientation. Culturally, it's a more Catholic, a bit more traditional area than the other large cities of Mexico. Mexico City, for instance, is a place where abortion is legal, gay marriage is legal. It's very progressive in that sense. And Guadalajara, in contrast, remains a very Catholic culture, traditional, more hierarchical, more traditional gender roles, and so forth. Then you have the border. The border is about 2,000 miles long, depending on whether you focus just on the border or the cities that are in the interior of border states like Monterrey and Chihuahua City, it accounts for 10 to 25% of Mexico's population. Historically, it was not as significant as the rest of the country, but over the past 60 or so years, the border population has just exploded, particularly from 1940 to 1970. It grew 10 times over. This trend continued with the expansion of the maquiladoras, twin plants that are mostly set up along the border, producing for export using imported inputs. The border is highly interdependent with the U.S. economy, which is a good thing and a bad thing. So we see that whatever happens to the United States economy gets amplified in terms of its impact on the border states. And one question which I'll just throw out at this point is that with NAFTA, one would think that the border would become less relevant as the economies become more tightly integrated and barriers to trade decline between them. However, after nearly 20 years of NAFTA being in effect, the border has continued to be highly relevant, and we really haven't seen as big of a push as many of us, myself included, anticipated for moving industry more into the interior and into the southern states. So the border continues to be very important, particularly for the maquila manufacturing. So now I'm going to shift gears from a regional focus to look at different economic sectors. Start off with manufacturing, which is an important sector for Mexico's economy, much more so than for the U.S. The U.S. has moved away from manufacturing. Manufacturing accounts for a small and declining percentage of employment in the United States. In Mexico, it continues to be roughly double the role in employment as it does in the United States. Traditionally, Mexico's manufacturing strength was focused in low-tech and heavy manufacturing. So at the low-end level were the first-generation maquiladoras, which focused on exporting simple items, things like golf club shafts, and those shafts have become more complex over time, but they used to be relatively simple products. Basic wire harnesses, upholstery for the auto sector, textiles, blue jeans, garments, and so forth, as well as a heavy manufacturing in steel, auto parts, and products for what was Mexico's captive, closed domestic market. Over the past 20 years now, 20 to 25 years, there really has been a transformation of manufacturing in Mexico. You still see some remnants of the past. However, for the most part, manufacturing in Mexico is now very state-of-the-art in terms of adhering to international quality standards. There's a big emphasis on ISO standards, ISO 9000 and other ISO standards. Movement towards more capital-intensive activities rather than resting on Mexico's old advantage of cheap labor. Mexico really doesn't have cheap labor anymore relative to other options that are out there, relative to the Vietnams, the Chinas, the Bangladeshs of the world. Mexico is actually has an expensive labor force. So there's more capital-intensive activities. And with the maquilas in particular, you see this shift from, for instance, as an example, from basic wire harnesses to very advanced electronic systems. A little more on the maquilas themselves. It's the way they're defined has actually shifted, so it now is hard to quantify exactly how much is being produced and exported by the maquilas, but the last good numbers that we had were roughly $120 billion a year in exports, which was approximately half of Mexico's total exports. However, only about 20%, and now it's growing a little bit, but a small percentage of that, less than half of it, is value added, meaning that the components are imported into Mexico, labor is added, and then it's re-exported, at least in the traditional model. The maquilas are highly cyclical. They're vulnerable to global economic upturns and downturns. And so if you were to look at what happens to the U.S. economy, in fact, the Federal Reserve Bank closely tracks the maquilas because they're a leading indicator of what's happening to the U.S. economy. If the U.S. economy is heating up, then the maquilas are just taking off. If the U.S. economy is going to start to slow down, then they see a dramatic downshift in maquiladora production. Traditionally, the three main sectors were automotive parts, electronics, and apparel. That last sector has really dropped. Mexico is no longer competitive in apparel for the most part. That's moved to Central America, El Salvador, and to Asia. But Mexico's maquilas remain highly competitive in electronics, in auto parts, and in many other activities, including service maquiladoras that say, for instance, if you buy a dish network dish and you return it to the store, that system will go down to a maquila in Mexico where workers analyze what's wrong with it and repair it. The locations for the maquilas remain concentrated in the border states and in the border cities of Juarez and Tijuana in particular. Those two cities are the two most important cities for maquila production, with Juarez accounting for a little bit more of the employment and having more of these mega plants, very large, humongous facilities, like the Electrolux refrigerator plant or the large Chinese Foxconn plant, which makes Dell laptops and other computers and so forth. Tijuana, on the other hand, has a larger number of maquilas, but they tend to be smaller, a little smaller, a little more entrepreneurial set of plants. The maquilas over time have migrated from these first generation, very simple maquilas whereby components were brought in, basically Mexican sweat was added, labor with very low skill and low training. Most of that has gone away. Mexico is no longer competitive in those activities, and so most of the maquilas these days are of second generation, or in some cases third generation, or which means much more knowledge based. If you look at the Delphi Tech Center in Juarez, it is a late stage R&D facility where they're developing prototyping and so forth for auto parts that will go into cars made 6 or 7 model years from today. Maquilas aren't everything in terms of manufacturing in Mexico. And these days, because the standards that define the maquila have changed, the line between what is a maquila and what is not a maquila is blurring. There's this new, relatively new umbrella for the maquila, the PITEX, and other programs called IMEX. Manufacturing, non-maquila manufacturing, tends to be more concentrated in areas other than the border. The border plants tend to continue to follow more of this twin plant model, whereby they're affiliated with plants typically in the U.S., but perhaps in Asia as well. And they're sort of sister plants where one activity takes place in the U.S., another activity takes place in Mexico. Once you get into the interior, you're more likely to find plants that operate in a more autonomous fashion, and those plants are also more likely to serve the Mexican market instead of simply producing everything that they produce for export. Moving to a different economic sector, looking at the financial sector. This sector is obviously very important, but it's also a good illustration of some of the shifts in Mexico over time. It's had a very tumultuous history. It was in the crisis of the early 1980s. It was nationalized. Then, about a decade later, in the early 90s, it was reprivatized. Then in the mid-90s, after the peso crisis of 94, almost the entire banking sector went bankrupt. And as a result, the only way to really stabilize the banking sector at that point was to allow foreign banks in. And so foreign banks now dominate almost entirely the banking sector. But it's become very stable and is growing. However, bank loans, if you take bank loans as a percentage of GDP, they still are far lower than they are in the United States or most other developed countries. Leading players these days tend to be foreign, including Citibank, which controls Banamex, and two Spanish banks that control the second and third largest banks. I mentioned previously this reemergence of the middle class. This creates opportunities for a wide range of financial services, and you certainly see this rapid expansion of consumer credit. Interest rates have declined, but there are certain areas in which credit is still inaccessible for certain segments. Other important sectors, one is energy. This continues to have state dominance in that the two major state-owned companies that remain are Pemex, which has a monopoly on oil, at least in terms of upstream activities. So all petroleum in Mexico is the patrimony of the state and managed by Pemex. The CFE is the state electricity monopoly, which handles the transmission and distribution of electricity, although the private sector is now involved in some of the generation. Tourism is another good illustration of Mexico's shifts over time. Traditionally, there was a heavy emphasis on state-led development. The public sector entity, Fonatur, and a variety of other public sector entities invested directly in building infrastructure, and in some cases in building actual hotels and other operators. These days, instead of these public investments in building mega resorts like Acapulco, Cancun, Huatulco, and so forth, there's a transition to a more diffused and hopefully a more sustainable model that involves more private sector activity in developing the tourism sector. Professional services is another sector that I'll mention because I think this is an area where there's this potential for a competitive advantage for New Mexico-based firms, especially Hispanic-owned firms or firms that employ a number of people who understand a bit of Hispanic cultures and are fluent in Spanish, because professional services entail much more personal interaction. This ought to be a sector where New Mexico would have an advantage. Within the different industries of Mexico, the last thing I want to mention is, or discuss, is the distinction between these very large businesses, often referred to as grupos, versus the emerging small business sector in Mexico. So the grupo historically has been a large, diversified conglomerate, pretty similar to what is found in other emerging markets like Turkey, Korea, Brazil, and elsewhere. These companies are often publicly traded but privately controlled. So their stock might be traded on the Bolsa Mexicana de Valores, and yet the family that historically has controlled them will continue to hold the largest share of the stock in the company, as well as have a variety of seats on the board and so forth. Some of the classic grupos spun off of the Grupo Monterrey, which produced and produces a wide variety of beers out of the city of Monterrey. Out of this came a steel company that itself diversified into auto parts and financial services and telecommunications and a whole wide range of other activities, a glass company, the beverage company, and many others. Another important grupo is Grupo Carso, which really is now this network of groups and their subsidiaries that all go back to one man, Carlos Slim, who, along with Bill Gates and Warren Buffett, is one of the wealthiest, the three wealthiest men in the world. And the center of his empire has really been telecommunications. He purchased and controlled the privatized previously state-owned telecommunications company, Telmex, expanded from there into mobile communications. The América Móvil now has a large presence throughout the Americas, and then is involved in a wide range of other businesses, has a reputation for buying up businesses for moving in when everybody else is moving out. Bought up the old Prodigy and CompUSA, MCI WorldCom, and others, and is also involved in things like banks, mining, retail, and so forth. Grupo Bimbo is one of the largest bakery companies in the world, and has expanded far beyond Mexico. Televisa is another company that competes internationally. They're the leading television company in Mexico, and many of their productions are also exported around the world. The Mexican, this is the company that initially took the Mexican telenovela or soap opera into global markets where it was well received. But beyond the grupos, there's and beyond the foreign-dominated maquilas, there are a large and increasing number of small and medium-sized businesses in Mexico. Mexico actually has one of the highest rates of entrepreneurship in the world. Now, much of this entrepreneurial activity is driven by necessity. These are people that don't necessarily have good opportunities in employment and are driven to starting up their own business. But it's also driven by opportunity. People who start a business because they see an opportunity and they want to seize it. Economic activity in Mexico remains fairly regionalized or localized, so it's important to understand that local context. And within the entrepreneurial sector, there's a growth in microfinance and social entrepreneurship as well. So this is the end of this presentation. I've listed here some links that you might want to check out, including the Gateway to Exporting program, as well as resources from the U.S. Department of Commerce and the Small Business Administration. And I hope this has been of use to you, and please check out the other webinars and get in touch with us if we can help you export to Mexico or other markets as well. Thank you.